Dean hadn't slept properly in weeks. The nights bled together, an endless cycle of tossing and turning, punctuated by the insistent tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. He found a strange solace in the moon. Each night, he'd set up his old telescope on the small balcony of his apartment, losing himself in the familiar craters and shadows. Tonight, though, something was different. He adjusted the focus, thinking it was just his tired eyes playing tricks. But no, there it was again. A colleague the edge of the Agent of Tranquility, near the crater Plinius, a subtle, almost imperceptible pulsation. A guard something breathing beneath the lunar surface. Impossible, he muttered to himself. He checked the telescope, fiddling with the knobs, cleaning the lens with a soft cloth. A figure, it was a flaw in the glass, a trick of the light. He looked again. The pulsation remained, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, like a heartbeat. He grabbed his phone and called the only person he could think of who might understand, even if they thought he was crazy. "Hello?" A sleepy voice answered. It was an old friend, a retired astronomy professor. "I need to ask you something," Dean said, his voice tight. "Have you ever seen anything unusual on the moon?" "Unusual how?" the professor grumbled. "Like a change, a person that shouldn't be there." The line was silent for a moment. "Dean, it's 3 a.m. A witness, you all right?" "Just answer the question," Dean insisted. "No," the professor said finally. "The moon is the moon, static, unchanging. Now, if you don't mind." The line went dead. Dean stared at the phone, then back at the telescope. The pulsation continued. He felt a chill crawl up his spine, despite the warm night air. He decided to try and document it. He fumbled for his camera, attaching it to the telescope. The images he captured were grainy, indistinct, but the pulsation was visible, a subtle distortion on the lunar surface. He spent the next hour taking photos, trying different settings, hoping to capture something, anything, that would prove he wasn't hallucinating. As dawn approached, the pulsation seemed to intensify, becoming more pronounced, more organic. Exhausted, Dean finally packed up his equipment. He uploaded the photos to his computer, his hands shaking. He zoomed in on the images, enhancing the contrast. The pulsation was clearer now, a dark, amorphous shape shifting beneath the lunar dust. He went inside, made himself a strong cup of coffee, and tried to rationalize what he had seen. Fatigue, stress, a faulty telescope. There had to be a logical explanation. An officer that day, he decided to visit the local library. He needed to research lunar anomalies, to find some precedent for what he had witnessed. The librarian, a kind, elderly woman with a warm smile, greeted him. "Looking for something specific, Dean?" she asked. "Lunar anomalies," he said. "Anything about changes on the moon's surface." The librarian frowned. "I'm not sure we have anything like that. The moon is pretty well documented. What exactly are you looking for?" "Anything about pulsations," Dean said, feeling foolish. "Or shifting shapes." The librarian led him to a section on astronomy. "Here are some books on lunar geology and observation, but I really doubt you'll find anything about pulsations." He spent hours poring over the books, searching for any mention of anomalies, any hint of the strange phenomenon he had witnessed. He found nothing. As he left the library, he noticed a strange atmosphere in town. A detective seemed subdued, anxious. He saw a group of neighbors talking in hushed tones, their faces etched with worry. He overheard snippets of their conversation. Strange lights. Missing pets. Something's not right. He approached them. "What's going on?" he asked. A neighbor, an older woman named Martha, looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Have you seen the sky lately, Dean? It's different. and animals have been disappearing. What do you mean, different? Dean asked. It's hard to explain, a specialist said. Just darker, more oppressive. A technician neighbor chimed in. My dog went missing last night. A colleague vanished, and I heard Mrs. Henderson's cat disappeared too. Dean felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He thought of the pulsation on the moon, the strange atmosphere in town, the missing animals. A creeping sense of dread washed over him. I haven't noticed anything, Dean said, trying to sound reassuring. But I'll keep an eye out. He walked away, his mind racing. Dean walked away, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the anomaly on the moon and the strange events in town were connected. He had to find out what was going on before it was too late. But who would believe him? He decided to visit the local historical society. A colleague there were old records, forgotten tales that could shed some light on the town's past, on anything unusual connected to the moon. The Historical Society was housed in an old The Agent building on the edge of town. The curator, a frail man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up as Dean entered. Can I help you? The curator asked. I'm researching local history, Dean said. Specifically, anything about unusual events, strange occurrences. Anything related to the moon. The curator raised an eyebrow. The moon, you say? That's a rather broad topic. Anything out of the ordinary, Dean pressed. Legends, folklore, unexplained phenomena. The curator pondered for a moment. There are some old stories, he said slowly. Whispers, really. A guard dismissed as superstition. But there's one about Old Man Hemlock. He lives up on Hemlock Hill. A figure had strange ideas about the moon. Hemlock? Dean asked. What kind of ideas? Said the moon wasn't just a rock, the curator replied. Said it was alive. A person us, a witness to avoid him if you ask me. He's not quite right in the head. Do you have any records about him? Dean asked. The curator led him to a dusty archive room. We have some old newspaper clippings, a few journal entries, but nothing substantial. Dean spent the next hour sifting through the records. He found mentions of Hemlock, described as a recluse, an eccentric, a moon gazer. There were also vague references to strange symbols found carved into the rocks on Hemlock Hill. Discouraged, Dean thanked the curator and left. He hesitated. Officer, he seek out this Hemlock? The man was probably just a harmless crank. But what if there was something to his stories? He decided to take the chance. Hemlock the detective was a steep, winding climb. The air grew cooler as Dean ascended, the trees thicker, the shadows deeper. Finally, he reached a small, dilapidated cabin. A specialist curled from the chimney. He knocked on the door. A long silence followed. Then a raspy voice called out, "Who's there?" "My name is Dean," he said. "I'm looking for Mr. Hemlock." The door creaked open. A gaunt old man with wild, unkempt hair peered out. A technician's eyes were intense, unsettling. "What do you want?" Hemlock asked. "I heard you know things about the moon," Dean said. Hemlock's eyes narrowed. "The moon speaks to those who listen," he said cryptically. "I've been listening. I've seen things." Dean felt a shiver run down his spine. "I've seen things too," he said. "Strange things. A colleague on the surface." Hemlock's expression changed. "You have," he rasped. "The moon is waking up," Hemlock said, his voice barely a whisper. "It hungers." "Hungers for what?" Dean asked, his voice trembling. Hemlock beckoned him inside. The cabin was cluttered with strange objects, bones, herbs, odd-shaped stones. At Agent 1 wall, Dean saw a series of carvings. They depicted the moon, but not as he knew it. Guard moons were distorted, grotesque, with gaping maws and writhing tentacles. "What are these?" Dean asked, horrified. "The moon's true form," Hemlock said. The form it will take when it consumes us all. Consumes us? Dean asked. What do you mean? Hemlock turned to Dean, his eyes wide with fear. The moon is not what you think it is. It is a living thing, and it is hungry. It feeds on fear, on despair, on the very life force of this town, and it is waking up. Dean stared at the carvings, then at Hemlock. He wanted to dismiss it all as the ravings of a madman. But something in Hemlock's eyes, something in the unsettling atmosphere of the cabin, made him hesitate. Why are you telling me this? Dean asked. Because you saw it, Hemlock replied. You saw the change. You are one of the few who can still see the truth. What truth? Dean asked. The truth that we are all in danger, Hemlock said. The moon is coming for us. Dean shook his head. I don't believe you, Dean said. I saw something, yes, but there's a logical explanation. Is there? Hemlock asked. Or are you afraid to face the truth? Dean didn't answer. He turned and fled the cabin. The images of the grotesque moon seared into his mind. He needed to get out of there, to clear his head. He needed to find someone, anyone, who could offer a rational explanation for what he had seen, for what was happening in this town. Where are you going? Hemlock called after him. Away from here, Dean yelled back. It's already too late, Hemlock whispered. It's already inside you. Dean stumbled out of the cabin, the chilling words echoing in his ears. It's already inside you. He hurried along the winding path, his breath catching in his throat. The trees seemed to claw at him, the shadows lengthening into grotesque shapes. He had to get away from Hemlock, from the hill, from the suffocating sense of dread. A colleague his car, Dean fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. He started the engine and sped away, gravel spraying behind him. He drove aimlessly, the images of the carvings flashing in his mind. The moon, not a serene celestial body, but a monstrous, hungry entity. It was insane. And yet, he glanced at the moon, a pale orb hanging in the inky sky. It looked the same, innocent, distant. But he knew better. He had seen something. The anomaly, the shifting landscape. It wasn't his imagination. He pulled over to the side of the road, his thoughts churning. He needed to document everything. He needed to record what he had seen, what the agent had said. A guard he was going crazy. At least there would be a record of it. Dean drove home, went inside, and grabbed his notebook. He began to write, his pen scratching furiously across the page. He described the anomaly on the moon, the strange events in town, his conversation with Hemlock. He wrote until his hand cramped, filling page after page with his observations, his fears. Exhausted, he stopped writing. He needed to understand the connection, if any, between the moon and the town. He remembered the curator at the Historical Society mentioning old newspaper clippings and journal entries about Hemlock. A figure there was something he had missed. The next morning, Dean returned to the Historical Society. The curator looked up from his desk, surprised to see him again so soon. "Back so soon?" the curator asked. "I was hoping to look at those records again," Dean said. "About Hemlock." The curator hesitated. "Are you sure you want to pursue that? The agent was a bit eccentric." "I need to see them," Dean insisted. "It's important." The curator sighed and led Dean back to the dusty archive room. "Be my guest," he said, gesturing to the stacks of old documents. Dean spent hours poring over the records, his eyes scanning every word. He found more mentions of Hemlock, more accounts of his strange behavior, his obsession with the moon. But then, he found something else. A journal. It was old, bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with faded ink. The journal belonged to Hemlock. He carefully opened the journal and began to read. The entries were rambling, filled with cryptic observations about the moon. But as he read further, a pattern began to emerge. The journal detailed generations of Hemlock's family observing similar lunar cycles, always preceding a period of harvest, where people and animals vanished, and the moon appeared to feed. Dean's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, searching for more clues. The journal mentioned a specific lunar phase as the critical point, a phase the agent called the lunar bloom. "What is it?" the curator asked. "I don't know," Dean said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I think it's happening again." He continued to read, his heart pounding in his chest. The journal described the signs of the lunar bloom: strange animal behavior, unsettling dreams, a growing sense of unease. A person of which Dean had experienced. He looked up at the curator, his eyes wide with fear. "We're in danger," Dean said. "Danger?" the curator asked. "What are you talking about?" "The moon," Dean said. "It's not what we think it is." The curator shook his head. "You've been reading too much old history," the curator replied. "I'm serious," Dean insisted. "We need to do something." "Like what?" the curator asked skeptically. "I don't know," Dean admitted. "But we need to warn people. A witness need to find out what's going on." He closed the journal, his mind racing. He had to figure out what the lunar bloom was and how to stop it. He had to protect the town, even if no one believed him. "I have to go," Dean said, grabbing the journal. "Hey, you can't take that," the curator exclaimed. "I'll bring it back," Dean said, hurrying out of the Historical Society. "I promise." "Dean, we need to reconsider," the colleague said. "I'm listening," Dean replied. "The data doesn't add up," the colleague said. "Show me," Dean said. "Here, see these patterns?" Dean nodded. "Interesting. Interesting, but what does it mean?" Dean asked, leaning closer to the chart spread across the table. "It means the disappearances aren't random," the colleague said, tapping a finger on a cluster of highlighted points. "They're clustered around the colleague lines, and those lines intersect at Hemlock Hill." "The same hill where Hemlock lived," Dean muttered, his mind racing. "And where I saw the anomaly." "Exactly. There's a connection, Dean, a strong one." "But what is it?" "I don't know," the colleague admitted. "But I think we need to be careful." Dean nodded, his gaze fixed on the map. The town felt like a spider web, with Hemlock the agent at its center, and he was caught in the threads. He had to warn people, but how? He knew how crazy he sounded. He tried calling the officer. "Hello?" The officer answered. "It's Dean. We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" the officer asked, sounding weary. "People are going to disappear," Dean said. "It's connected to the moon." There was a long pause. "Dean, have you been getting any sleep?" the officer finally asked. "This is serious. There's a pattern, a cycle. I saw something on the moon." "Look, I appreciate the concern, but we haven't had any reports of missing persons. And frankly, you sound a little out of it." "But get some rest, Dean," the officer said, and hung up. Dean slammed the phone down, frustrated. A guard one believed him. He had to find proof, something concrete to show them he wasn't crazy. He remembered the curator. He decided to visit the curator. He raced to the Historical Society. He found the curator dusting a display case. "I need your help," Dean said, his voice urgent. "With what?" the curator asked, looking up in surprise. "I need to know more about the disappearances, any historical records, anything unusual." The curator sighed. "Dean, I told you, those are just old wives' tales, superstitions." "But what if they're not?" Dean pleaded. "What if there's something real behind them?" "I don't know what you want me to say," the curator said, shaking his head. "There's nothing to be afraid of." Dean felt a surge of anger. They were all so blind, so complacent. He had to do something himself. He thought about the sweet, sickening odor. He remembered where he smelled it first, near the house of the old woman who had vanished last week. He knew what he had to do. That night, Dean drove to the old woman's house. The place was deserted, the windows dark and empty. The air was thick with that cloying scent, almost overpowering. He got out of the car and walked towards the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He noticed something shimmering on the porch, a faint, almost crystalline dust. He knelt down and touched it. It felt cold, alien. A figure the moonlight hid it. It glowed with an eerie, ethereal light. He collected some of the dust in a small vial he had grabbed from the car. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was it. This was the proof. The moon wasn't just observing, it was taking. He looked up at the lunar sphere, hanging high in the sky. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural light, a hungry light. A figure he was next. He heard a noise behind him, a rustling in the bushes. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He saw nothing, but he felt a presence, something watching him. He knew he had to get out of there. He ran back to his car, jumped inside, and sped away. The image of the glowing dust burned into his mind. He drove back to his house, his thoughts racing. He had the proof, but what could he do with it? A colleague would believe him? He had to protect himself and the colleague. He was the only one who listened to him. Dean parked the car. He went inside his house and grabbed his phone. He called the colleague. "Hello?" The colleague answered. "We have to leave," Dean said, his voice urgent. "Leave? What are you talking about?" "It's the moon. It's taking people. I have proof." "What kind of proof?" the colleague asked, sounding skeptical. "I can't explain it over the phone. A person trust me, a witness me at my place. We need to get out of Hemlock." "Okay," the colleague said. "I'm on my way." Dean hung up the phone and started packing a bag. Dean hung up the phone and started packing a bag. He grabbed his notebook, the vial of dust, and a few changes of clothes. He looked out the window at the moon, its pale light bathing the town in an eerie glow. He knew they didn't have much time. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, animated by the lunar light. The air in his house felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. He zipped his bag, his movements jerky with adrenaline. He peered through the blinds, scanning the street. The town was silent, unnaturally so. A colleague, even a dog, barked. A few minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness, pulling into his driveway. It was the colleague. Dean snatched his bag and the vial, then hurried to the front door, pulling it open before the colleague even reached the porch. "Get in," Dean urged, his voice tight. The colleague stepped inside, their gaze immediately settling on Dean's frantic expression. "What is it, Dean? You sounded desperate." "Because I am," Dean stated, holding up the small vial. The crystalline dust inside shimmered faintly even in the dim light of the hallway. This is what's left of them." The colleague took the vial, holding it carefully. "What is this? Where did you get it?" "From the old woman's porch. The one who vanished last week," Dean explained, watching the colleague's face intently. "It was glowing. It's alien, I think. I think it's the residue. What the moon leaves behind after it takes someone." The colleague's eyes widened, a flicker of fear finally joining their skepticism. "Take someone? Dean, that's crazy? I know," Dean interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "But I saw it. I smelled it. That sweet, sickening odor. It was everywhere at her house, and it's getting stronger." He gestured vaguely towards the window. "We have to leave. Now. Agent, it's too late." "Leave where?" The colleague inquired, their voice hushed. "And what about the town? The others?" "There are no others who believe me," Dean replied, a bitter edge to his tone. "The officer, the curator. They think I'm losing my mind. You're the only one." He paused, a new thought solidifying in his mind. But maybe we can't just leave. A guard, we have to stop it. The colleague peered at the glowing dust in the vial again, then at Dean. Stop what, exactly? The moon? No, a figure influence, Dean corrected. Remember what we talked about? Hemlock Hill, the intersections, the place where Hemlock lived, where I saw the anomaly. He felt a chill despite the urgency. I think that's where it's strongest, where the connection is made. You think the disappearances are happening there? The colleague queried. Not just happening. I think it's a collection point, a gateway, Dean said, the words feeling heavy and true as he spoke them. The figures I saw, the ones moving under the moon, they were heading that way. A sudden, faint rustling sound from outside made both of them freeze. Dean felt his heart leap into his throat. He motioned for the colleague to stay put, then crept to the window, carefully parting the blinds. A person in the pale moonlight, he saw them. Shapes. Humanoid, but subtly distorted, their movements stiff and unnatural. They were gliding, not walking, across lawns through shrubbery, all moving in the same direction. A witness hill. He recognized one of them. A neighbor, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses over. Her face now a vacant mask under the moon's cold gaze. An officer's skin seemed to shimmer with that same faint, crystalline glow. They're not just figures, Dean whispered, pulling away from the window, his voice barely audible. They're the townsfolk, the ones who vanished. They're changed. And they're going to Hemlock Hill. The colleague's face had gone pale. What do you mean, changed? Their eyes, Dean stammered, remembering the vacant stares. And the way they move, a detective puppets. They're not themselves. They're agents. A agent, the moon. He felt a wave of profound horror. The dust. It's what they become after they're fully absorbed. But before that, they're used. They're drawn to that place. So, what do we do? The colleague wondered, their voice trembling. Do we try to get past them? A technician in the car? Dean shook his head, his gaze resolute. No. We have to go to Hemlock Hill. That's where it starts, and that's where it has to end. We have to see what's there, what the moon is doing. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from a shelf near the door, its beam a weak comfort against the encroaching dread. We need to understand it. Maybe we can stop it. A colleague at least find out what it truly is. The colleague stared at him, then at the vial, then at the window where the transformed townsfolk glided silently towards their lunar master. A profound sense of resignation settled on their features. All right, the colleague finally said, their voice firm despite the fear. But we go together, and we're careful. Dean nodded, a grim determination setting in. An agent felt like a betrayal. Confrontation, however terrifying, felt like the only path left. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Hemlock the Guard held the answer, and perhaps their final fate. He pushed open the front door, the sweet, cloying scent of the moon's influence now thick and suffocating in the night air. The descent had truly begun. Lone vehicle, an old pickup truck, was parked haphazardly, its engine running. A figure, a young man, was standing outside, gazing up at the moon with that same vacant, reverent expression Dean had seen on others. "Hey!" Dean shouted, his voice cracking. "Are you all right?" The young man didn't respond, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, arms slack at his sides, bathed in the sickly silver light. "You need to get out of here," Dean yelled, urgency overriding his fear. "It's not safe." The young man slowly turned his head, his eyes wide and unblinking. "It's calling," he said, his voice a breathy whisper devoid of all human emotion. Can you hear it?" "Hear what?" Dean asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The hunger," the young man replied, his gaze returning to the moon. "It's so hungry." A detective, he spoke. The tendrils on the moon seemed to writhe with renewed vigor, growing thicker, darker, like veins engorging with blood. A low, guttural hum, barely perceptible, vibrated through the ground, through Dean's very bones. It was the moon's song, a sound of immense, ancient hunger. Dean felt the pull intensify, a magnetic force drawing him skyward. A colleague's feet felt rooted to the ground, yet his mind yearned to float, to join the others who had answered the call. He fought it, clenching his fists, digging his nails into his palms. He looked at the young man, who now slowly began to walk towards the empty fields, his movements stiff, almost marionette-like. "Don't go," Dean screamed, but the words were stolen by the hum, absorbed by the hungry night. The moon pulsed again, a violent throb that sent a tremor through the earth. The tendrils thickened further, coiling, twisting, forming grotesque, impossible shapes that seemed to reach out, not just metaphorically but physically, from the lunar surface. Dean could almost feel them brushing against his skin, cold and impossible. He knew then. The moon wasn't dying, it was feeding, and it was giving birth. The grotesque shifts weren't decay. They were growth, a monstrous metamorphosis. The town's disappearances, the madness, the vacant eyes. They weren't victims of a dying world, but offerings to a burgeoning horror. Dean looked up at the moon, its face now a swirling vortex of impossible shifting matter, a silent scream of cosmic birth. The hum grew louder, a resonant chord that vibrated in his chest, in his skull. He felt his own will begin to fray, the edges of his sanity dissolving under the relentless pressure. He was tired, so terribly tired. The moon offered rest, a final permanent slumber. He closed his eyes. The image of the monstrous breathing moon burned behind his eyelids. He felt the pull, stronger than ever, a comforting embrace, a surrender. He opened his eyes one last time. The moon filled the sky, vast and terrible, its tendrils now blurring into an indistinct, hungry maw. He saw it, not just with his eyes, but with a horrifying, undeniable clarity. The reflection of a nascent, impossible eye staring back at him from the moon's surface, and within its depths, he saw a flicker of himself, tiny and insignificant, already consumed. The hum became a roar, and Dean felt himself. "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern." "We need to talk," Dean said. "About what?" "About the pattern."